Moses and Aaron, chosen by God to deliver his message to Pharaoh, are called to stand before the ruler of Egypt with a powerful command.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness.
This bold declaration is not of their own making, but is given to them directly by the Almighty, the God of their forefathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This moment marks the beginning of an epic journey for the Israelites, one that will lead them from the bondage of Egypt to the freedom of the Promised Land. But this journey, as Moses and Aaron soon discover, will be far more difficult than they could have imagined. Moses, having been called by God from a burning bush in the wilderness, is no stranger to divine instruction. Yet, standing before Pharaoh, the mighty king of Egypt, he is aware of the great risk that lies ahead. Pharaoh is not a ruler who easily entertains defiance, and the consequences for challenging him could be severe. Still, Moses' faith in God drives him to act. He delivers the message faithfully, knowing that it is not his words but God's will that he is proclaiming. The first response from Pharaoh, however, is swift and harsh.
Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?
Pharaoh sneers. His arrogance is palpable as he dismisses the very idea of the God of the Hebrews. In Pharaoh's mind, Israel is nothing more than a group of slaves, and their God is powerless. The king of Egypt, consumed by his pride and self-sufficiency, believes that he is in control of everything, and that no one, least of all the God of a people he considers inferior, can challenge his rule.
I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go,
he declares coldly, rejecting Moses and Aaron's request with contempt. This bold rejection of God's authority is not a mere statement of defiance. It is a declaration of Pharaoh's power and his determination to maintain control over the Israelites. He cannot fathom that a people whose God he does not even recognize could demand anything from him, especially freedom. In Pharaoh's mind, Israel is his property, and their plight as slaves is of no consequence to him. His pride blinds him to the truth that he is standing in opposition to the one true God, whose power is far greater than his own. Pharaoh's rejection of the request is just the beginning of a series of trials for the Israelites. Rather than giving in to the demands of Moses and Aaron, Pharaoh escalates the oppression. He orders that the taskmasters increase the labor of the Israelites. No longer will they be given straw to make bricks, a crucial material for the building of the empire. Instead, the Israelites must now gather their own straw from wherever they can find it, yet they must still meet the same quota of bricks. The burden upon them becomes unbearable, and the suffering deepens. The new decree from Pharaoh only serves to further oppress the Israelites. What was already a life of hard labor becomes even more grueling. The people who were already struggling under the weight of their bondage now find themselves faced with an even greater challenge. They are forced to work harder, to gather straw from distant places, all while still being required to meet the impossible expectations placed upon them by their Egyptian taskmasters. The labor grows more intense, the hours longer, and the weight of oppression heavier. As the Israelites toil under these new conditions, their officers, those who have been appointed to oversee the labor, become the recipients of Pharaoh's wrath. When the brick quota is not met, the officers are beaten and punished, blamed for the failure to meet the impossible demands. These officers, who were supposed to be leaders among the Israelites, are now reduced to nothing more than victims of Pharaoh's cruelty, just as much as the workers they oversee. In their desperation, the officers come to Moses and Aaron, bringing with them their pain and frustration. They cry out to Moses, blaming him for the increased suffering.
The Lord look upon you and judge.
They accuse Moses and Aaron, believing that their leadership has only made things worse. They accuse them of causing the suffering they now endure, unable to see the larger picture of God's plan for deliverance. The officers, once hopeful that Moses and Aaron would be their means of liberation, now see them as the source of their greater misery. The weight of this accusation falls heavily on Moses. He too is suffering under the strain of the situation. His heart breaks for the people, and he is filled with doubt. In his desperation, Moses turns to God in prayer, asking,
"Why have you so evil entreated this people? Why is it that you have sent me?"
Moses, the great leader called by God to deliver the Israelites, now finds himself questioning the very purpose of his mission. He had hoped that his confrontation with Pharaoh would be the catalyst for their immediate deliverance, but instead it has led only to greater suffering. The people are in pain, and the burden seems insurmountable. Moses feels as if the weight of the world is on his shoulders, and he does not understand why things have taken such a turn for the worse. In this moment of doubt and confusion, Moses cries out to God, expressing his frustration and seeking answers. "Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he hath done evil to this people."
Moses says.
"Neither hast thou delivered thy people at all."
Moses cannot understand why God has allowed the situation to worsen instead of improving. He wonders if he is the cause of the people's increased suffering and if his mission has been a failure. Yet despite his doubts, Moses does not abandon his faith in God. He seeks understanding, turning to God in his time of need. In this moment of prayer, Moses is confronted with the harsh reality that God's plan is not always immediately apparent. God's ways are often mysterious, and his timing is beyond human comprehension. Yet even in the midst of hardship, God is at work. The Israelites may not understand why they must endure such suffering, but God is preparing them for something far greater than they can imagine. Their journey will be long and fraught with challenges, but through these trials, they will come to learn to trust in God fully. It is through their suffering that they will be shaped into a people who can enter the promised land with faith and obedience. God's response to Moses is one of reassurance. He reminds Moses of his covenant with the Israelites, the promise made to their forefathers. God tells Moses that he will deliver the people, but the process will take time. Pharaoh's heart will be hardened, and the people will endure more trials. But God's plan will unfold in his perfect timing. The path to deliverance will not be easy, but it will ultimately lead to the freedom of the Israelites. Moses learns a valuable lesson in this moment of trial. God's timing is not always aligned with human expectations. The journey to freedom will be long and filled with challenges, but the end result will be worth it. The Israelites will be free, but they must first learn to trust in God's sovereignty, even when the way forward seems unclear. Moses too grows in his faith through this experience. He learns that God's deliverance is not just about freeing the people from physical slavery, but also about teaching them to rely on him completely. In the end, the people of Israel will come to know that their true freedom is found not just in escaping Egypt, but in fully surrendering to the will of God. Though the road ahead will be difficult and filled with moments of doubt, Moses and the Israelites will learn that God's promises are sure. The trials they face will refine their faith, preparing them for the great victory that is to come. Through it all, God's presence will guide them, and his deliverance will be certain. In the midst of suffering, God's faithfulness will shine through, and the people of Israel will come to understand the depth of his love and power.
The Israelites, under the heavy yoke of Egyptian slavery, felt the weight of their chains every day. Bound to a land that did not love them, they wept under the merciless cruelty of Pharaoh's orders. All their dreams, all their lives were in the hands of a ruler who saw them not as people, but merely as slaves. However, everything changed the day God decided to choose one man who would bring freedom. One man who would direct their gaze towards something higher, towards salvation that would come through suffering. Moses, leaving the comfort of Egypt, where he had grown up as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, was now called to return to the land where the Israelites were suffering. In the heart of the desert, on Mount Horeb, a burning bush appeared before him. It was a moment when God spoke his name, a moment when God showed that he had not forgotten his people.
"I am your God,"
God said, calling Moses to embark on the path of salvation. At that moment, though feeling unworthy, Moses accepted the call. He did not know what awaited him, but he trusted that God would give him the strength to endure whatever came. Moses and his brother Aaron stood before Pharaoh with the words entrusted to them by God.
"Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me."
But Pharaoh, focused on his own power and pride, could not even imagine that his regime could be challenged.
"Who is the Lord that I should listen to his voice?"
Pharaoh asked. His heart was hardened, and he refused to listen to the words that came from God. In his self-assurance and strength, he saw himself as invincible. The Israelites then suffered even more. They were not only forced to work under harsher conditions, now they had to gather straw, while their overseers, sorrowful and helpless, bore the brunt of Pharaoh's soldiers. New orders brought even greater suffering for the Israelites. Their bondage was no longer only physical, it spread to their souls. All of them felt hopeless. Moses, though called by God, felt deep suffering because he saw that his words had become the cause of even greater affliction. The people blamed him. Even those who had hoped for his leadership now turned their backs on him, saying that he had brought them into deeper slavery.
"Why did you bring us before Pharaoh?"
They asked, accusing him of increasing their burdens. Moses, filled with pain and uncertainty, did not know what to do. He was weary, spiritually drained. In that moment, deeply shaken, he turned to God and asked,
"Why, Lord, have you sent me to do this? Why have you allowed everything to get worse?"
His faith was being tested. In his soul there grew a sense of helplessness, for he could only see suffering and not liberation. God's response was calm but full of strength.
"I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have promised your brothers that I will set them free, and my promise will be fulfilled."
God promised Moses that his salvation would come, but not immediately. The path to freedom was not easy. The Israelites had to go through many more hardships before they realized that their path to salvation was bound to their faith and loyalty to God. In those moments of suffering, God was at work, though they could not see the whole plan. And so Moses continued his mission, facing repeated refusals, but with firm faith in God's power. Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, but God's hand was present. Through Moses, God sent signs and wonders until the terrible plagues came upon Egypt. Each new catastrophe, each new plague, was part of God's plan to save his people. The Israelites had to learn, through suffering and trials, to rely completely on him. At last, when the moment came, God freed his people. Although the path to salvation had been long and full of suffering, through faith and obedience, the Israelites experienced deliverance. Moses, now fully empowered by God's will, led the people through the sea that parted before them, and they stepped into a new future, free at last. And as they left Egypt, they carried with them the realization: every suffering, every moment of pain had been part of a larger plan, a plan of salvation that led to freedom. God had not only freed their hands, but he had also shaped their souls. The Israelites were no longer just a people of slaves. They had become a people of faith, a people of God's promise. In the land of Egypt, under the heavy weight of Pharaoh's oppressive rule, the Israelites lived as slaves, their spirits crushed by relentless toil and suffering. For generations they had known only hardship, their lives bound by the whims of a merciless ruler. But despite the oppression, they clung to hope, believing in a promise made long ago to their ancestors. They held on to the belief that one day God would deliver them from their bondage and lead them to a land of freedom and abundance. God had not forgotten his people. In his perfect timing, he raised up a leader, Moses, a man born in the midst of the very oppression that held his people captive. Moses was no stranger to the pain of his people, having grown up in the palace of Pharaoh, but never forgetting his heritage. His life was a paradox, raised as an Egyptian prince but always feeling the weight of the suffering of the Israelites. In his heart, a fire burned to free his people, but he did not yet know how or when God would use him. One day, while tending to his father-in-law's sheep in the wilderness, Moses encountered something extraordinary, a bush that burned with fire, yet was not consumed. This was no ordinary fire. It was a divine manifestation of God's presence. From the midst of the flames, God spoke to Moses, calling him by name and commanding him to return to Egypt to deliver the Israelites. The voice of God was not just a call to action, it was a call to faith, a call to trust in his plan, even when Moses felt unworthy and inadequate for such a monumental task.
"Go,"
God said,
"for I have heard the cries of my people, I have seen their suffering, and I am sending you to bring them out of Egypt."
Moses hesitated. His heart was full of doubt.
"But Lord, who am I to do such a thing? I am not a great leader. I am not eloquent in speech. How can I convince Pharaoh to let your people go?"
But God reassured Moses, promising that he would be with him every step of the way.
"I will give you the words to say, and I will show you signs to prove my power,"
God declared.
"Go, for I am with you."
Filled with both fear and faith, Moses returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron, ready to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. They stood before Pharaoh with a simple yet powerful message.
"Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may worship me."
But Pharaoh, prideful and stubborn, rejected their words. He saw no reason to listen to these men, believing that his own power was absolute.
"Who is this God?"
Pharaoh scoffed.
"I do not know the Lord, and I will not let the Israelites go."
Thus began a series of confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh. God sent 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt, each one a demonstration of his power and authority. The river turned to blood, frogs covered the land, locusts devoured the crops, and darkness blanketed Egypt. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. With each plague, he promised to release the Israelites, only to change his mind once the plague was lifted. The Israelites watched in awe as the mighty hand of God moved against their oppressors. But even as they saw these signs, their own faith was tested. Their lives were difficult, and they too struggled with doubt and fear. Would they ever be free? Would God truly deliver them from their suffering? It was only when the final plague came, when the angel of death passed over the land of Egypt, taking the lives of every firstborn Egyptian, that Pharaoh finally relented. His pride was broken, and he ordered the Israelites to leave Egypt immediately. The night was filled with the sound of hurried footsteps as the people packed their belongings and prepared to flee. The journey to freedom, however, was not an easy one. As the Israelites left Egypt, they found themselves at the edge of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army in hot pursuit. Desperation filled their hearts as they saw the mighty Egyptian chariots coming toward them, and they cried out to Moses.
"Why did you bring us out here to die?"
they asked.
"Were there not enough graves in Egypt?"
Moses, however, stood firm in his faith.
"Do not be afraid,"
He said,
"stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. He will fight for you."
With a prayer, Moses raised his staff, and the waters of the Red Sea parted, forming a path of dry land through the sea. The Israelites crossed safely, with the waters standing like walls on either side. When Pharaoh's army followed, the waters returned, drowning the Egyptian soldiers and securing the Israelites' freedom. The Israelites had been delivered. They had crossed the threshold from slavery to freedom, from suffering to salvation, but the journey was far from over. In the wilderness, they faced more challenges. Hunger, thirst, and uncertainty plagued them, but God provided for them every step of the way. He sent manna from heaven to feed them, and water from a rock to quench their thirst. He led them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Despite God's provision, the people's faith remained fickle. They complained, doubted, and longed for the comforts of Egypt. Yet God remained faithful. He gave them his laws on Mount Sinai, guiding them with a covenant that would be a light to them and to the nations around them. Through the wilderness, the Israelites learned the painful but necessary lessons of trust, obedience, and patience. They learned that salvation was not just about deliverance from slavery, but about a deep and abiding relationship with God. They had to learn to rely on him, not only for their freedom, but for their daily needs, their protection, and their hope. As the years passed, the Israelites grew as a people, and eventually, they entered the Promised Land. Their journey from bondage to freedom, from suffering to salvation, had been long and difficult. Yet in the end, they understood that it was not just the destination that mattered, but the faith and trust that had been forged in the fires of their struggles. God had kept his promise. Through Moses, he had delivered his people from slavery, and through the faith of the Israelites, he had brought them into a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where they would dwell in peace, and where his presence would guide them forever. The story of the Exodus is not just a tale of ancient history. It is a story of redemption, of God's faithfulness, and of the power of faith to transform lives. The Israelites' journey from Egypt to the Promised Land is a picture of the journey every believer must take. It is a journey of salvation through faith, of deliverance through trust in God's plan, and of transformation through the struggles that lead us closer to him. Imagine a time when a people, bound by slavery for generations, held on to nothing but hope. Their backs were broken under the weight of harsh labor. Their cries for deliverance reached the heavens. This is the story of the Israelites' escape from Egypt, a journey not just of physical deliverance, but of faith, struggle, and transformation. In the land of Egypt, under Pharaoh's ruthless rule, the Israelites suffered greatly. Forced into servitude, they were slaves, without hope, without a future. Yet, deep in their hearts, they still clung to a promise, the promise made to their forefathers that they would one day be free and inherit a land of their own. And in that moment of despair, God remembered his people. Enter Moses, a man chosen by God. Born to a Hebrew family raised in the Egyptian palace, Moses was destined for something greater. Though he lived in privilege, he never forgot his people. But when Moses grew older, he fled Egypt after committing a crime. For years he lived in the wilderness, far from his people and his purpose, until one day he encountered God in the form of a burning bush. From the flames, God spoke directly to Moses. He called him to go back to Egypt and deliver his people.
I have seen the suffering of my people,
God said.
and I have chosen you to lead them out of bondage.
Moses hesitated. He was unsure.
Who am I, Lord?
He asked.
How can I stand before Pharaoh and demand freedom for your people?
But God reassured him.
I will be with you. I will give you the words to speak. I will show Pharaoh my power.
Reluctantly, Moses returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron by his side. They stood before Pharaoh, demanding that he let the Israelites go. Pharaoh, proud and defiant, refused.
Who is this God? He scoffed.
And so God unleashed a series of plagues upon Egypt, one after another, each a display of his power. The river turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the land. Locusts devoured the crops. Darkness covered Egypt for days. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Each time the plague ended, he promised to let the Israelites go, only to change his mind when the suffering ceased. The people of Israel watched, amazed, as God revealed his power through these plagues. But their faith was tested too. Could they trust that God would truly deliver them? They had lived in oppression for so long that their hope began to waver. Then came the final devastating plague, the death of the firstborn. The angel of death passed through Egypt, taking the life of every firstborn son, from Pharaoh's household to the lowliest servant. The Israelites, however, were spared. God instructed them to mark their doorposts with lamb's blood, and the angel would pass over their homes. This event became known as the Passover, and it marked the beginning of their journey to freedom. After this final plague, Pharaoh finally relented and commanded the Israelites to leave. In haste, they packed their belongings, left Egypt, and began their journey to the Promised Land. But their troubles were far from over. As they reached the shores of the Red Sea, Pharaoh's heart once again hardened. He pursued them with his army, intent on bringing them back. The Israelites found themselves trapped. On one side, the vast sea. On the other, Pharaoh's advancing forces. In this moment of terror, Moses turned to God.
"What do we do now?"
He cried. God instructed him to lift his staff, and as he did, the waters of the Red Sea parted, creating a dry path through the water. The Israelites walked through, and when Pharaoh's army followed, the waters returned, drowning the Egyptian soldiers. It was a miracle. The Israelites had crossed from slavery to freedom, from despair to hope, through God's intervention. Though they had escaped Egypt, their journey was far from over. The wilderness was a place of testing. The people of Israel began to complain. They were hungry, thirsty, and uncertain. Had they been brought out of Egypt just to die in the wilderness? Yet God provided. He sent manna from heaven to feed them and water from a rock to quench their thirst. He guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Despite their complaints, God never left them. At Mount Sinai, God made a covenant with his people. He gave Moses the 10 Commandments, the laws that would guide them and set them apart as his chosen people. These laws were not just about following rules, they were about living in a way that honored God and loved one another. The Israelites were called to be a light to the nations, showing the world what it meant to live in obedience to the one true God. The journey to the Promised Land took many years, but God was faithful. He provided for his people, even when they faltered. And eventually, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites stood on the brink of the land promised to them by God. They were about to step into a new life, a new beginning, and a new destiny, a life of freedom, hope, and purpose. The story of the Exodus is not just about a people who were delivered from slavery. It is the story of faith, of struggle, and of God's unwavering faithfulness. The Israelites' journey is a picture of our own spiritual journey, a journey from bondage to freedom, from doubt to faith, and from despair to hope. Through their story, we learn that even in our darkest moments, God hears our cries. He sees our suffering, and he will make a way for us to be free, just as he did for the Israelites. So, as you watch this story unfold, remember, no matter how difficult your journey may seem, God is with you. He will guide you, provide for you, and lead you into the promise he has for your life. In a land full of oppression and suffering, a people long forgotten by time began to cry out for deliverance. The Israelites, enslaved under Pharaoh's oppressive rule, had been working relentlessly for centuries, with no hope of ever seeing the light of freedom. But God heard their cries, and he had a plan, one that would change the course of history forever. This is the story of the Exodus, a journey of faith, struggle, and ultimate triumph over adversity. A journey that would shape not only the lives of the Israelites, but the very foundation of faith for generations to come. The story begins in the land of Egypt. For years, the Israelites lived in bondage. Their lives were marked by harsh labor and endless suffering. The Pharaoh who ruled Egypt had hardened his heart against them. But in their despair, the people didn't lose their hope completely. They remembered the promise made by God to their forefathers, that they would one day be free and would inherit a land flowing with milk and honey. For generations, they had been waiting. And while their burdens grew heavier, their faith, though tested, remained unbroken. But how would they be freed? How would the chains of slavery be broken? God was about to answer their prayers. Enter Moses, a man chosen for this very moment. Born to Hebrew parents, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house, raised as a prince of Egypt. But as he matured, he learned of his true identity. In his heart, he carried the pain of his people. One fateful day, after witnessing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, Moses, in anger, killed the Egyptian and fled Egypt, fearing for his life. For years, Moses wandered in the desert, living a quiet life as a shepherd. But little did he know God was preparing him for something greater. One day, as Moses tended his flock on the slopes of Mount Horeb, something unusual caught his attention. A bush that burned but was not consumed. Curiosity led him closer, and as he approached, the voice of God spoke from the flames.
"Moses, Moses,"
God called.
"take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground."
In that moment, God revealed his plan to Moses. He had seen the suffering of his people and had chosen Moses to lead them out of Egypt to freedom. Moses, overwhelmed and unsure of his ability, questioned God.
"Who am I to stand before Pharaoh? What should I say to the people of Israel?"
God reassured Moses.
"I am who I am. I will be with you, and I will give you the words to say."
Reluctantly, Moses agreed to obey God's calling, but he was not alone. He was given his brother Aaron to speak on his behalf, and together they set off for Egypt to confront Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron stood before the great Pharaoh, demanding,
"Let my people go."
Pharaoh, a powerful ruler who trusted in his own gods and might, dismissed them.
"Who is this God that I should listen to him?"
Pharaoh scoffed, hardened by his pride and power. Thus began a series of confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh, which would escalate into miraculous events that shook the very foundations of Egypt. God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt, each one more devastating than the last. The river turned to blood, frogs covered the land, locusts swarmed the crops, and the earth was covered in darkness. Despite each plague, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to let the Israelites go free. Each time the plague ceased, he reneged on his promise to release them, showing his utter disdain for God's power. But God's plan was unshakable. The final and most devastating plague was the death of the firstborn son. The Israelites, however, were spared. God instructed them to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. This act of faith became known as the Passover, an event that would later define the identity of the Israelites. Finally, after the death of his own firstborn son, Pharaoh's heart broke. He sent for Moses, ordering him to leave Egypt immediately. The Israelites, in haste, packed their belongings, gathered their families, and left the land of Egypt. But their freedom was not to come easily. As they approached the Red Sea, they were confronted by a terrifying sight: Pharaoh, with his army in pursuit, seeking to bring them back into captivity. The people were filled with fear.
"Why did you bring us here to die?"
They cried to Moses. But Moses, with unwavering faith in God, responded,
"Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today."
Moses raised his staff, and the sea parted before them, creating a dry path through the waters. The Israelites walked through the Red Sea, while Pharaoh's army followed in pursuit. But as the Egyptians reached the middle of the sea, Moses stretched his staff again, and the waters returned, drowning Pharaoh's chariots and soldiers. It was a moment of incredible deliverance, a miraculous act of God's power and faithfulness. The Israelites were now truly free. Though they had escaped Egypt, their journey was far from over. The Israelites found themselves in the wilderness, a place of trials, struggles, and testing. They faced hunger and thirst. At times they complained, longing for the familiar comforts of Egypt, even though they had been slaves there. But God remained faithful. He provided food from heaven, manna, and water from a rock. He led them with a cloud by day and a fire by night. Despite their grumbling, God's provision never faltered. Finally, the Israelites reached Mount Sinai, where God called Moses up the mountain. There, he gave Moses the 10 Commandments, laws to guide his people and to set them apart. These commandments were not just rules, they were a covenant, a promise that if the Israelites followed God's commands, they would be his treasured possession, a holy nation, a light to the world. As Moses descended from the mountain, the people witnessed the glory of God. They had received his law, his instructions, and his promises. The journey was not just about freedom from slavery. It was about becoming a people who would walk with God, guided by his love and truth. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness lasted 40 years. Many perished along the way, but the younger generation, those who had not known Egypt's bondage, grew in faith. When the time finally came, the Israelites stood on the edge of the promised land, ready to claim the inheritance that God had promised. The Exodus story is not just about the Israelites. It is about every believer who walks through the wilderness of life, struggling with trials and doubts, and yet clinging to the hope of God's promises. The journey is not easy, but God is faithful. He guides, he provides, and he leads us to freedom. Just as the Israelites were delivered from slavery, so too can we be delivered from the bondages that hold us back. And just as God parted the waters of the Red Sea, he will make a way where there seems to be no way. The Exodus is a story of redemption, faith, and the power of God to set his people free. It is a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey may seem, God's promises are sure and his faithfulness is unbreakable.